that logic is so distorted and so tone deaf to the spirit of this legislation, because what's happening is, in reality, you're saying, reality is saying, if the Caucasian has a 3.5 and the African American has a 3.5, we're going to let the Caucasian guy in because he's not black. And that's what reality is.
Yeah.
And Thomas fails to address that with his stigma argument. So Chief Justice Roberts goes on, and for his part, pointed out the court's 2003 decision reaffirming the constitutionality of affirmative action programs, noting that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the court at the time, had suggested that there would have to be an end at some point in the future. And Roberts declares that time is now. And I think the problem is, it hasn't. Human beings...
It's only gotten worse.
Not even human beings. Americans have not gotten to the point that they're mature enough to assume, to understand that all men are created equal. With the amount of legislation that's happening today that is discriminatory, that is holding African Americans down, that's holding Asian Americans down, the hatred that is an upswelling of political force in this country today is a clear indicator that not only are we not ready, we're not moving in the right direction, we're sliding backwards from where we need to be.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be something we say a lot on this episode. It feels like we're regressing.
Yeah,
and I think it is absurd to assume that the time is now is when we need to end affirmative action. If anything, we might need to go the other way with it to make it more affirmative, right? Because things seem to be only getting worse, and that's going to be a common theme here. We also have the opposing view, and this is from Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She said that the court subverts the constitutional guarantee of equal protection by further entrenching racial inequality in education, the very foundation of our democratic government and pluralistic society. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the court's first black female justice, also chimed in saying, with Let Them Eat Cake obliviousness today, the majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat. Sorry. When you're quoting Supreme Court justices, they're much smarter than I am. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life, which is exactly what we just talked about. Just because you say it's that idea of like a post-racial America, right? Like we elected Obama, racism's over. It's like, no, it's not.
Right.
And that is clearly being reflected here as well.
Yeah, no, and the problem that we run into here is that what the majority are arguing here is they're arguing the point of a fiction, that in a perfect world, we shouldn't need this legislation. And they're right. In a perfect world, we shouldn't. The world we live in is far from perfect.
Yeah.
And this happened to be a stopgap measure to make things better. Nothing else has happened in this world to make that situation better. Mm-hmm. If anything, that situation's gotten worse. So by taking away some of the safeties that you had in place to try to provide legal protections for people, you're doing your part. You're being part of the problem, not part of the solution at that point.
Yeah, why did they do this? just to have a rule? What was the motivation behind it? I don't even like.
Well, the motivation is what motivates conservatives to want to do things like this.
Yeah, I guess just further the agenda, right?
Right. They're pushing an agenda which they shouldn't be pushing an agenda. They should be looking at each and every case on a standalone basis and making educated, objective decisions. They should not be influenced by party politics, and that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I wonder if we'd have as harsh criticism if it was the other side. Right, but I also think the liberal agenda or Democratic agenda is not as aggressive as the conservative agenda, and not as
which, by its definition, doesn't make sense.
Right,
that your conservatives are the more aggressive,
and that you're supposed to not like big government, right?
Exactly,
and this is the opposite of that. This is the biggest government.
Well, you could argue that this is a limitation of government because it's government making impositions over the schools. And they're saying, well, government shouldn't do that anymore. The schools need to regulate themselves.
I more so meant the 6-3 majority basically being able to do whatever it wants without being like stopped.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think
I see what you mean though.
the motivation that they have at this point in time is, we're a progressive Supreme Court now. We're going to do things right the way that we see it. We're going to make the changes that should have been made years ago, and they're going to undo what's being undone. And there's a couple of problems with that. One, you're undoing existing precedent. So by every time you undo a precedent, like they did in the last session when they overruled Roe versus Wade, every time you overrule a Supreme Court precedent, you delegitimize the Supreme Court.
Nope.
The whole point of the Supreme Court
It's the word. It's final.
is it's supreme.
Right.
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 So when the Supreme Court can override the Supreme Court, then what the Supreme Court today, who's overriding that, says can be overridden.
Who watches the Watchmen?
Right. So they're delegitimizing the Supreme Court. So that's probably one of the biggest problems that you run into. The other problem is the things that haven't been ruled on, that really are important stuff that need to be ruled on, are being pushed to the side so that they can use this agenda that they have to rewrite the rules that have already been written. So you're hurting the country. Be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
And you talk about the correcting itself. So the Supreme Court overriding itself. It's like it really does. I didn't even think about that until just now. It really does have a very harmful effect because that basically could eliminate precedent in general. Because
Absolutely.
if they rule on now and then in 10 years there's different judges and they just are like, no, that's not. We're just gonna get rid of that. It's like, well, then what was even the point of doing it in the first place? It's like it's all temporary until you have a majority the other way that comes in and just does everything the other way. It does really delegitimize the whole process.
And that's what we've seen with political parties as well. One political party will come in and they'll be in power for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever, they control legislative and executive, and they'll push their agenda. And the other side will fight them tooth and nail. Then they'll switch powers and the balance changes. And then the other guys are fighting. And nothing gets done. Nothing substantial gets done. We don't get universal health care. We don't get tax reform. We don't get any of the things that the country needs because they spend all the time fighting. Now, we expect that from our politicians. We don't expect that from our Supreme Court. We deserve better from our Supreme Court because these are appointed positions. They don't have to campaign. They don't have to get elected. They're not chosen by the people. They're handpicked, they're cherry-picked by the president, and it's for life. And they need to be held. They're not even held to the same standards, the same moral and ethical standards that lower courts are held to. There's no ethical board that oversees the Supreme Court. You would think instead of being the exception to the rule, the Supreme Court should be the precedent to the rule. They should be the ones that are under the most scrutiny. Their taxes should be looked at on a regular basis. Their gifts that they receive, their rulings everything should be looked at. Their political affiliations, the friends that they take their vacation trips with, all of that stuff should be gone over with a fine-tooth comb on a constant basis because of the position they're in and the power that they possess.
Yeah.
It's dangerous that it's not. And it's dangerous that these people can possess more power than the elected officials in this country. That's really where the problem is. And it has a broader impact. This recent decision is likely to cause ripples throughout the country. And not just in higher education, but in selective primary and secondary schools. Ultimately, effects will be felt in every aspect of the nation's economic, educational, and social life. From the Rooney Rule that requires a minority applicant to be considered in all NFL coaching hiring decisions, to employment and promotion decisions, the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in schools and workplaces, and much more. The Supreme Court literally just said discrimination is legal.
Yeah.
That's what this decision says. And that is exceedingly dangerous for this country.
And I really think it is naive too, because how do you how are you able to exist, especially as a Supreme Court justice, where you've been dealing with law your entire life? Surely you'd be able to see that people are not treated equally, right? These things, if you let things run themselves, they will not run well, right? Like, it's not going to just fix itself. It's not going to be equal if you let people do it, because like we talked about at the top of this break, affirmative action was put in the first place because it wasn't equal. So it's like, do you think that's just going to magically fix itself, especially now when, hate crimes are on the rise and discrimination's worse than it has been in a very long time? And, but then again, maybe that's all part of the plan.
Well, and I'll be the first one to say, I watched the hearings when Clarence Thomas was up for Supreme Court nominations, and the questions that he was asked and how racially biased the people that were questioning him from the other side were, and that was Democrats questioning him at the time. It was brutal. And that was a small fraction of what he's had to put up with his whole life. Because he's a man who has set precedent his entire life with his career being African American, doing the things he did. You would think going through that and then making the statements that he said on this ruling, they were coming from two completely different people.
Yeah, like how do you even believe that when he says that?
Right.
Like,
It's astonishing what he's saying now and what he's been through in his life.
Yeah.
So
and that was point number 1.
Yeah.
We've got 2 more to do.
That was rough. We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about something that might be a little closer to you, and that is the student loan forgiveness plan being rejected. We'll be right back.
Insights into Entertainment, a podcast series taking a deeper look into entertainment and media. Our husband and wife team of pop culture fanatics are exploring all things from music and movies to television and fandom. We'll look at the interesting and obscure entertainment news of the week. We'll talk about theme park and pop culture news. We'll give you the latest and greatest on pop culture conventions. We'll give you a deep dive into Disney, Star Wars, and much more. Check out our video episodes at youtube.com/insightsintothings. Our audio episodes at podcast.insightsintoentertainment.com, or check us out on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. We are continuing our discussion on the Supreme Court's recent rulings. So in this segment, we're going to talk about the rejection of the student loan forgiveness plan. The Supreme Court effectively killed President Joe Biden's $400 billion plan to cancel or reduce federal student loan debts for millions of Americans. The 6-3 decision, we've heard that number a lot, with conservative justices in the majority, said the Biden administration overstepped its authority with the plan, and it left borrowers on the hook for repayments that are expected to resume in the fall. The court held that the administration needed Congress's endorsement before undertaking so costly a program. The majority rejected arguments that a bipartisan 2003 law dealing with national emergencies, known as the HEROES Act, gave Biden the power he claimed.
The president said he would work toward a new path for student debt relief using the Higher Education Act, which he called, quote, the best path that remains to provide as many borrowers as possible with debt relief. He also moved to create a, quote, on-ramp that would help ease the risk of default for students who fail to make payments when the current pause ends. Biden blamed Republican officials. Again, it's always the other guy's fault. Biden blamed Republican officials for causing the dispute that led to Friday's ruling, saying, quote, they had no problem with billions in pandemic relief loans to businesses, and those loans were forgiven. But when it came to providing relief for millions of hardworking Americans, they did everything in their power to stop it.
That's actually a pretty good quote from Biden.
Yeah.
I feel like we don't get a lot of those.
I'm sure it was written and somebody else wrote it.
Loan repayments will resume in October. Can't wait for that. Although interest will begin accruing in September. The interest is where they get you, by the way. The Education Department has announced payments have been on hold since the start of the coronavirus pandemic more than 3 years ago. Oh my God, where does the time go? The forgiveness program would have canceled $10,000 in student loan debt for those making less than $125,000 or households with less than $250,000 in income. 26 million people had applied for relief, including me, and 43 million would have been eligible, maybe me, the administration said. The cost was estimated at $400 billion over 30 years. Yeah, this is a heartbreaker. Let's really hoping this will go through. Obviously, I'm biased. I have student loan debt. And this $10,000 would have been a decent chunk of my loans that would have really helped me out. Now, I understand. I hear the argument, right? People are saying, well, you have to work to pay off your loans. But if you go watch, and I don't remember what episode it was, the episode where we talked about student debt, we talk about how the cost of college has gone up astronomically. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, you have to work harder, right? And this usually comes from the older generation of telling people my age, well, you just have to work hard. You need to stop buying your avocado toast so you can afford to buy a house one day, when it's really not that simple. Especially when interest, like I mentioned, the interest is where they're going to get you, because as the interest compounds and compounds on itself, I've heard so many stories of people that have been paying their loans for like 30 years and they still owe more than when they started because of the interest.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is another one of those situations where the proposed solution is treating the symptoms, not the problem. I totally agree that $10,000 off your loan would be really nice. But the problem isn't how much you borrowed. The problem is how student loans are structured. And in the episode that we had talked about student loan, the fact that it's predatory, number one, where these banks are coming after students knowing what the cost of college is and the potential for getting paid back over time, the banks are willing to wait for it, especially when they know they're going to take your debt and they're going to sell it to other companies and make money that way. And then these companies that sell it then get investors to invest in it. And the last thing these investors want you to do is pay your loan off. Yeah. What they want you to do is keep paying your interest, because that's how they get their money. The problem isn't necessarily students that borrow money to go to college. Part of the problem definitely is the cost of college, which has gone up unjustifiably. The other problem is these aren't traditional loans. These are credit cards, basically. If you went out and you bought a house, say you bought a house, we'll just use round numbers. You bought a house for $100,000 and you get 10% interest, which is like credit card interest on a house, by the way. But we're just doing it to illustrate.
Economics are hard.
So at the end of 30 years, you would have paid $10,000 in interest on that house. So your house would have cost you $110,000. That's it. The amount of interest that you're going to pay on that house is calculated the day that you get your loan. And it's a fixed amount. They amortize it over the course of the loan. And for the first 15 years, the majority of what you pay is going towards interest on that house, so the bank gets their money back. The bank is guaranteed to get their money back. After 15 years, the majority of the money is principal on the loan until you pay the loan off. By the time you get to the last 5 years on the loan, you're paying almost nothing in interest because the interest has already been paid back. But it's a fixed amount. If they structured student loans the same way, rather than charging you compound interest like a credit card, this problem would go away tomorrow. You would take out a $100,000 loan from the bank for your student loans. You'd pay your 10%, and the most you'd ever pay is $10,000 on that loan under that situation. And the problem of never-ending payments doesn't come into play. The problem of paying $100,000 more than the $100,000 that you were charged for your education goes out the window. That's what they should be concentrating on. They shouldn't be concentrating on trying to give you $10,000 towards your loan. That's not going to solve the problem. Because the problem is you owe that money to somebody, so the government's going to give you forgiveness. Well, the government has to pay that somewhere. So where's the government? The government's not a for-profit organization, right? They don't sell, lemonade. They don't have a lemonade stand somewhere where they're making money. The money comes from the taxpayers.
Right.
So their entire income is us. So if you're not paying your loan, someone's paying it, and it's the rest of the American taxpayer. And that's why it's very difficult to convince somebody who doesn't have student debt to pay for somebody who has student debt. What they should be doing is they should be changing the way the student loans are structured. They should be capping the interest payments on there. They should be capping how opportunistic these loans are.
And how easy they are to get.
Yes, if you did that, you could solve this problem. Until then, you're shining a turd here trying to make something pretty out of it.
Now, I will put on my tinfoil hat here. You mentioned that this really isn't fixing anything. But for people like me that are important for a Democratic president that may be running for re-election soon, this would be a great reason to get a vote for him, right?
Well, you are. And that's a good point. So he's buying your vote. That's
Right.
really what this is. The problem is that the demographic that you are, the number of participating voters in that demographic are disproportionately smaller than the number of senior citizen voters, the ones who are going to be on the hook for paying that back. So that logic is valid, but the practice itself doesn't work because the numbers don't work out.
Yeah.
Because if you could get more people your age to get out and vote, it would work. But we can't. You know, the voting percentage of people in your demographic is like 15% or something like that.
I guarantee it's going to be even lower.
Right, where the voting percentage of people 65 and older is like 70%. So that's not going to work out in your favor, even if he is trying to buy your vote.
Yeah, you're not buying enough of the vote.
Right.
He
Right.
should repay, he should make it like an elder care bill or something.
Right, but if you fix the problem and you fixed how student loans were financed, it would work for because it won't cost the government anything at that point. You simply write legislation that says how you have to conduct your loans, and you then enforce that legislation. And people who don't abide by that legislation, you impose a fine on them, and the government has another source of income without paying for loans.
So why do we think what's stopping them from doing this restructuring? It seems pretty simple.
It is, but the problem is you have to get both parties to agree to it. And they can't agree to the color of the sky at this point.
Yeah, especially even if they want to, because it's from the other side, they're not going to do it.
Exactly. Joe Biden could propose legislation that would solve world peace and guarantee food on the table for every human being on the planet, and the Republicans would oppose it because a Democrat proposed it.
And they'd call it woke too, probably.
Right. And it's not our responsibility to create world peace. You'd get stupid arguments like that.
Yeah.
When it's like, why can't these idiots just do what's right for the country and what's right for the citizens? They can't, because if it makes the other guy look good, then in turn it makes them look bad.
Right. When in reality it doesn't. It's we should all be in this together. We all live here.
Right.
But
I mean, you look at the parties now going into the primary, both parties are tearing at each other's throat, telling you why you shouldn't vote for the other guy of their own party.
which is contributing to voter apathy, which is why people don't want to vote.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll make this another episode, but I was always of the mind that you should always vote no matter what, and I'm really being convinced maybe not. I don't know who we're gonna have in the presidential election coming up, but it's gonna be tough for me to pick somebody, right? And I know we go with the old lesser two evil arguments, but they're both pretty bad, or they both probably will be pretty bad. And I don't know. Like I said, we could make another episode, but it's the first time in my life since I've been able to vote, this will be my 5th year, because I'm 23, I guess 24 by then, or 5. But yeah, it's really a struggle. It's difficult, and I understand that voting is important and that you should always vote. But on the other hand, it's I feel responsible for who I vote for.
and that's the thing. Most voters go out there. So there's a large chunk of voter that votes along party lines because their parents did, and they'll never change. And they're kind of locked in. There's a certain percentage of those. Then there's the kind of people who are easily swayed, the kind of people who hear one argument, don't do any research, and go do their thing. They're the uninformed voter. Then there's the informed voter. They're probably the smallest percentage out there. They're the ones the politicians are terrified of. Because if you're smart enough to go out and do your own research from multiple sources and draw your own conclusions, you terrify politicians. They want mindless lemmings out there that they can tell you who to vote for, and you'll just go do it. And if you vote along party lines, you're the ideal candidate. They don't have to say anything. They could go out there and kill people in the streets. and you'll still vote for them.
Yep.
That's what they hope for. And if you're informed, and the one thing that we try to do on all of our podcasts is to educate and inform people, enlighten people. Don't listen to what I'm telling you. Don't listen to what we say on the show. Go do your own research.
Yep.
If I'm wrong, come back and tell me that I'm wrong about something. I'm happy to hear that, and I'm willing to have my point of view changed if it's legitimate. But don't just vote. You know, the politicians go out there, oh, you have to vote. It's important. Go vote.
They guilt you. No.
Right. But, as a citizen, it's your job that's the one duty that you have is to vote. But what they're really saying is vote for me.
Right.
And voting is important because it's the only way that our kind of government continues to exist. So I totally advocate people vote. But when you're voting, if you're voting in your local election or your school board or something like that, understand the choice that you make affects you. You may not think who's in Congress affects you, but I'll guarantee you it does, because the amount of money you pay in taxes and the amount of money they take out of your pocket is something you can control by who you vote for. And if you vote somebody in this time and they don't do what you want, or you don't think that by the end of their term you're better off, or if you are worse off, vote the next guy in. And then vote the next guy in. Keep doing that until you teach them that you're in charge. The first thing the politician wants to do when they get into office is get reelected. That's their number one priority. It's not you. It's not their constituents. It's not the people that contributed to them. It's to get reelected. And they're never going to vote term limits on themselves. The highest office in the land has term limits. Politicians, Congress, Senate, they'll never do that. We have the power to do that. If you don't let incumbents get reelected, you're imposing term limits. And even if the guy gets in and you like him, vote him out. And vote the next guy out. And vote the next guy out. Don't let him get entrenched. Don't let him get in there. Don't let him create a power base or start to influence things or anything. That you've got people now, and I'm going off topic obviously here, but it's important to discuss. You had Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell gets up there the other day and does a presser, and something in his brain hits pause right in the middle of it. Now, I'm not saying this to be mean or facetious or anything. It was very clear the man had some kind of health issue at that moment. But they walked him off the stage and brought him back a little bit later after they did whatever they had to do to fix the wiring there so he could finish what he was saying, so he could pretend like he was still okay. And that was just so they could keep power. That's what they're doing. They did the same thing the same day Dianne Feinstein.
Was that where they told her to just say aye?
Just say aye.
Yeah.
Because she was completely oblivious as to what was going on because she was so far gone.
We see it with Biden all the time, too.
Yeah. And, this isn't a crack on old people or mental illness or anything like that. But there comes a point when you're no longer effective at your job.
Right.
And when you get to that point, I used to unload tractor trailers for a living. And when I hurt my back, I couldn't do that anymore. So I knew I had to change careers. I had to go do something else that was not impactful to that. And I did. Had I kept doing it, I wouldn't be able to do my job and I'd get fired. You can't allow people to stay in power who can't do the job.
And unloading tractor trailers is much lower stakes than running the country.
That's true. That is true.
And that's the part that scares me, is like you have these people that may not, and it's okay, when people get to a certain age, you might not be all there.
Absolutely.
But that you shouldn't also still have the same amount of power as you did when you were fully lucid.
Right. They talk about Reagan when he was in office, where he started having onsets of Alzheimer's. And do you really want someone who's suffering from a disease like that to have his finger on the nuclear button?
Yep.
Like, you have to do what is right. You have to have some moral sense of right and wrong to put your foot down in these times, or at least have the gumption and the class to step away and say, look, I can't do this anymore. I'm not up to it anymore. I can't do it the way that it needs to be done. Let a younger person come in and do this type stuff. We as the voter have the power to do that.
The more you know.
Anyway, that's it for my soapbox for there. We're going to run over time here, but that's okay. we're going to come back with our last segment here and talk about religion, free speech, and gay rights. That should be a quick one. We'll be right back.
Insights into Teens, a podcast series exploring the issues and challenges of today's youth. Talking to real teens about real teen problems. Explore issues from braces to puberty, social anxiety to financial responsibility. Each week, we talk about the topics concerning today's youth. We look at how the issues affect teens, how to cope with these issues, and how parents, friends, and loved ones can help teens handle these challenges. Check out our video episodes on youtube.com/insightsintothings. Catch our audio versions on podcast.insightsintoteens.com or on the web at insightsintothings.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. We are still covering the Supreme Court's recent decisions after a brief aside.
Sidebar into politics.
Yeah, but we're back, and this is our last point for today. Religion, free speech, and gay rights. That's a lot, but we're going to do our best. The 6-3 decision, which turned on the court's interpretation of the First Amendment, appeared to suggest that the rights of LGBTQ people are on more vulnerable legal footing, particularly when they're at odds with claims of religious freedom. The ruling was the court's latest in favor of religious people and groups, notably conservative Christians. The Supreme Court sided on Friday with a web designer, recently. The Supreme Court sided recently with a web designer in Colorado who said she had a First Amendment right to refuse to design wedding websites for same-sex couples despite a state law that forbids discrimination against gay people.
Justice Neil Gorsuch, is that Gorsuch?
I have no idea.
I'm not very good
Neil.
with names. Neil. Justice Neil.
I'm sure he loves to be called that.
Writing for the majority in a 6-3 vote, said the First Amendment protected the designer, Lorie Smith, from being compelled to express views she opposed. Quote, 100 years ago, Miss Smith might have furnished her services using pen and paper. No less protected speech today because they're conveyed with a voice that resonates further than it could from any soapbox.
Yeah, I was reading the show notes before the show. What? I don't understand what that means. Like, what is he saying?
Basically, he's saying that because it's something that's being done to reach, it's no different than if it was a printed material.
Okay, gotcha.
The case, though framed as a clash between free speech and gay rights, was the latest in a series in favor of religious people and groups, notably conservative Christians. At the same time, the ruling limited the ability of governments to enforce anti-discrimination laws. The justices split, surprisingly, along ideological lines, and the two sides appeared to talk past each other, kind of like politicians tend to do. The majority saw the decision as a victory that safeguarded the First Amendment right of artists to express themselves. The liberal justices viewed it as something else entirely, a dispute that threatened societal protections for gay rights and rolled back some recent progress. This also comes at a time when transgender people are facing increased discrimination at the local and national level, with the American Civil Liberties Union stating that there are currently 492 bills in the works around the country that would directly harm transgender individuals.
And this goes back to what we're talking about with this backsliding that we're feeling, right? This is another example of that. Using the Constitution as the weapon. In an impassioned dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned that the outcome signaled a return to a time when people of color and other minority groups faced open discrimination. It was the second time this week that the justice summarized her dissent from the bench, a rare move that signals deep disagreement. Appearing dismayed, Justice Sotomayor spoke for more than 20 minutes. Quote, "This case cannot be understood outside of the context in which it arises. In that context, the outcome is even more distressing. The LGBT rights movement has made historic strides, and I am proud of the role this court recently played in that history. Today, however, we are taking steps backwards. A Colorado law forbids discrimination against gay people by businesses open to the public, as well as statements announcing such discrimination. Ms. Smith, the woman who owned the website, who has said that her Christian faith requires her to turn away same-sex couples seeking website design services. I'm sure that's probably in the Bible. Jesus probably has a Squarespace page. Seeking website design services has not yet begun her wedding business, nor has she posted a proposed statement on her current website about her policy and beliefs for fear, she has said, of running afoul of the law. So she sued to challenge it, saying it violated her rights to free speech and the free exercise of religion.
So you jumped on my point too quickly there. So, okay, first of all, there's nothing in the Bible that is anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ, nothing like that. There are no teachings.
There's not? I thought there was.
Nothing.
I'm not even joking. I legitimately thought there was about like
not
men.
a single mention.
Oh.
There are stories about same sex. There are instances of it occurring in there. Nothing is ever preached against. In fact, if you go by the teachings of Jesus, Jesus says to love all men, to love all people. So there's nothing in there. How the court could even use that as an excuse, number one. Number two, I'll guarantee you there's nothing about websites in the Bible, okay? Maybe the new King Charles Bible there might be, but there's nothing in the King James Bible or before it that has anything to do with it. So that's a falsehood.
And that makes sense why Justice Neal had that quote that he had, because you have to frame it so it's legitimate.
Right.
And not a bunch of baloney.
So, and the other problem that I have here is she's not being forced to express opinions that are contrary to her beliefs. She's being contracted to produce a website for someone else. If she didn't like fur coats and she made a website for someone selling fur coats, nobody would confuse her as being the person selling fur coats. Mm-hmm. So using that as logic for why you can't produce something for someone else is bogus. So there isn't a single argument in this case that has a leg to stand on.
But it worked.
But somehow the conservative Supreme Court decided to latch onto this with as flimsy an argument as it was to set precedent again.
And to legalize discrimination.
And that's exactly what it is. That is how dangerous this Supreme Court is, and that is how broken this Supreme Court is that they took something that was so flimsy, it shouldn't have gotten past...
It's like a Judge Judy case.
Right. It shouldn't have gotten past TV court. Yeah. Okay? It was literally that weak of an argument. And somehow the Supreme Court decided that was important enough to listen to.
And to create such strong precedent.
Right.
Which makes you wonder that they could do it with anything, right?
The Supreme Court receives hundreds and hundreds of cases a year to hear. And they go through and they cherry pick the ones that they feel are the most important, the most impactful, and the ones that are the most influential on the Constitution. And they pick this steaming pile of crap as one of the ones that they wanted to talk about.
It's pretty tough to not argue there's an agenda when this is what they go with.
Exactly. That's why it was vitally important that we talk about this one.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed at our Supreme Court for even listening to arguments on this case. It's that bad.
Right. And it's like, if you actually look at the case, it is just gay people trying to exist. And when you look at a lot of these anti-LGBT laws or anti-trans laws, it is just people trying to live and maybe get married. And it's like, it's always framed as if they have this agenda, like they want to take over the country, the LGBT people.
Indoctrination. Yeah. You got to throw that in there,
It's a bunch of baloney, man. These people are just trying to live and be treated fair and equally, but that's just not allowed.
No, and the worst part is the state itself had already passed legislation that prevented this.
Right. So move.
Now, the problem that I have, I have several problems with this. The other problem that I have here is this Constitution says any laws that the Constitution does not explicitly cover Florida states' rights.
Yep.
There's no anti-discrimination law in the Constitution. So therefore, if the state has a law that governs it, the state should take precedent. The Supreme Court should have had no jurisdiction over this case whatsoever because of that law that was on the books.
Yeah, should have been done right down there.
So it should have never even gotten to the Supreme Court.
But when you can politicize anything and you can make an agenda out of it, because now it becomes an issue of the First Amendment, which isn't that the one about free speech? First Amendment?
Free speech and freedom of religion.
Yeah. So, but like it's...
So how does her freedom of religion trump the other people's free speech by having a website?
Right.
Someone needs to explain that one too.
Yeah. Yep. It's pretty tough. No matter what side of the spectrum you're on politically, it's pretty tough to argue that there is not an agenda here. Especially this. It's good we ended with this, because this is like the standout.
It's the smoking gun.
Yeah.
You know, not only is it an agenda, it's a poorly thought out, poorly researched, and poorly executed agenda.
And a hateful one.
Yeah, and it's blatant. Like it's like the expectation that Americans are stupid is written into this agenda, because you're not supposed to see this stuff. You're not supposed to pay attention to it. Supreme Court rule. They're supreme, so it should be okay, right? Only we're overturning other Supreme Courts, so it's really not supreme. It's kind of the okay court now.
Yeah.
Just do as we say, though. That's the hypocrisy that our country is dealing with today.
Yeah, and it goes back to that. You know, we talked about the feeling of regression and the feeling of legalized discrimination. And again, we mentioned this a lot. But if you're an audio listener, we're two white guys, so
Right.
You know, it's really not impacting us that much. I can't imagine what it must be like being a transgender person or a member of the LGBT community or a minority or a woman. Like, there's just so many people out there